On the TOEFL speaking test, there are 4 sections on the test, divided up into 2 general categories: the independent speaking section and the integrated speaking section. Now, the independent section contains a free choice response, which is what we'll be looking at in this first video, and a paired choice response. Whereas on the integrated speaking section, there are 2 different tasks totaling 4, 2 from the read, listen, and speak category, and 2 from the listen and speak. And we'll be exploring those in a future video. And the total test time is around 20 minutes. Now, in terms of evaluating your results on this section of the TOEFL, it's a little bit different from what you find on the reading and listening sections. Instead of being an objective test with multiple choice answers, this particular part of the test is evaluated holistically. Holistically is referring to when you're looking at the overall score or the overall result. So in this case, it's looking at your kind of entire response instead of just counting individual errors. Now, in this section of the test, each criterion is measured from 0 to 4, 4 being the highest and 0 the lowest. And when you receive your overall TOEFL speaking score, you actually will receive a scaled score and then your proficiency level. So, for example, the maximum score is 30, and then you would receive a particular score based on how it's interpreted from the test. Now, the first thing we should note is that we've been using the TOEFL Quick Prep download to help us explore the questions on the test. However, the prep download does not include a free choice example question. So we're actually going to just look at an example here for the purposes of explanation. For the speaking section itself, there are several tasks, but the TOEFL Prep download does not include all of them. Now, first off, it should be noted that the topics themselves are pretty much involving your personal opinion. So that's kind of the first thing that's nice about this part of the test, is that there is no objectively right or wrong answer. You'll notice that the topics usually involve something about daily life, but they could also be about other topics, but you'll notice that those topics are not controversial, which means, for example, you will not see questions about sex or politics or any of those kinds of things. Now, the questions, though, are also sometimes hypothetical. Now, hypothetical means not real, but imagine that they are. So, for example, if you were thinking about, what would you do if you won $1 million? Well, obviously, unless you actually won $1 million, this is what we call a hypothetical question. So, for example, what would you do if? Or where would you like to go? So notice the key word in both of those is the word would. And again, sometimes the questions are about your personal goals and objectives in life. And I find that's especially true on the speaking section. Again, if you've studied for the TOEFL before, you notice that this has a somewhat of a similarity to the TOEFL independent writing sections, which will be explored in a future video series. But again, I've noticed that most of the speaking topics generally are talking about something personal. Usually they want some details about your life. But for the most part, they're more about you and your opinion. So we're going to go ahead and jump in and look at an actual topic. And again, the idea here is that, notice they're looking for you to choose what the answer is. In other words, you get to explain your particular opinion. So let's take a look at the question and how it would be delivered on the test. Choose a place you go to often that is important to you and explain why it's important. Please include specific details in your explanation. You have 15 seconds to prepare your response and 45 seconds to deliver it. So first thing you notice on the test is that they will read the question for you. So you are actually not spending your 15 seconds reading it. They actually will read it before they start the time. So that's nice. And then, of course, during the preparation time, they will tell you how much time you have, and then they will indicate when it's time for you to speak. So, all told, the entire activity is a little more than 60 seconds, if you count the prep time and the delivery time, but also the time they take to read the question. Now, the first thing we're going to look at, and again, there are lots of tricks and hints and strategies we're going to be discussing in this video, but the first thing is addressing the prompt itself, because sometimes the prompts can be very confusing. Now, generally, the speaking task will employ one of these two tricks. First off, they will include vague wording that is open to different interpretation. So, for example, it said, choose a place that's important to you. But notice they don't specify what kind of place. Is it a country, a city? Can I choose a place in my own town? What about a place in my house? It doesn't really say. Or you will see oftentimes that they will include extreme wording that is often difficult to defend. Now, we see this more, I think, in the writing sections. But don't be surprised if you see a question that might say, it's always better to do something. And do you agree or disagree with that? Or people should never. So notice those two words, always and never, are fairly extreme. If you think about it, there are not many things in life that we would always do or never do. So again, the TOEFL loves to use these particular tricks in the prompts. Now again, I think you see this second idea more in the writing section. But again, don't be surprised if you might see a question in either of the speaking tasks that use these tricks. Of course, another confusing idea is the fact that every prompt mentions the condition that you must use specific details, but it doesn't mention how specific, or which details might be more important than others. So again, this is part of your decision and when you're delivering a response. So in our example, notice again the question involves a personal opinion. So it doesn't specify what kind of place, so the first thing we need to recognize is that there is no objectively right or wrong answer. It could be somewhere in your hometown. It could be visiting a foreign country. The question does not specify. So in a way, that's nice. It kind of gives us a little more freedom in answering the question. But the question about specific details, that could be a problem. For example, should we describe this place in physical terms? You know, if I mention a particular city, do I have to go into detail about the city itself if it's a city everybody knows? For example, what if I said New York City? Well, this is a city a lot of people know. So do I have to describe its size or give an idea, how many millions of people live there? Of course, another question we have to think about is, do we have to fill up the time completely? It says we have 45 seconds to deliver a response. So, is it more important to fill all 45 seconds? Should I have more words than fewer words? And of course, a thing that students are always wondering is what about grammar? Are they really not listening exclusively to my grammar? So again, these are all important questions that the prompt itself doesn't really answer. Now, some clues are really going to be found in this information, which is the TOEFL Speaking Rubric. And again, you'll find a link to this at the bottom of the video in our YouTube channel. So I would really suggest, making sure you download this because we're going to be looking at it from time to time throughout the video series. So, looking at the rubric itself, as we mentioned before, the holistic scores are listed over here on the left. So, as we mentioned earlier, 4 is the highest score, 3 is next, 2, and then so on. But notice in each area, we're given kind of different dimensions. And the key is to think about what can these particular these particular words help us in getting a clue as to what the test is looking for. Well, first off, notice in the general description, it mentions that it fulfills the demands of the task, with at most minor lapses. So in other words, a few mistakes, but that's acceptable. It's highly intelligible, exhibits sustained and coherent discourse. So one of the first things we need to recognize is we should not use a lot of pauses, or we should not repeat ourselves a lot because we need to keep speaking, but not in a nice, fluid way. Now notice what it says here at the last sentence. A response is characterized by all of these things that follow. So again, it's well-paced, it's clear, it has only minor problems. So again, there's that word minor. Minor indicating that they're not in a serious influence. but they do not affect your ability to be understood. That's what intelligibility means, that someone can understand you. It demonstrates effective use of grammar and vocabulary, and it exhibits a fairly high degree of automaticity. Automaticity means basically that you can kind of speak of these things in kind of groups or chunks without really thinking about them. So, for example, when someone says, "How are you?" you respond, "Fine, thanks. How about you?" Notice how that result becomes fairly automatic. And the idea is because you probably say it more than once a day. So part of the challenge here is we've got to use a lot of good structure and complex ideas, but we have to do it in a way that doesn't sound like that it's new to us. We have to make it sound like we have mastered these things. Notice it says the response is sustained and is sufficient. It's well-developed and coherent. And the relationship between ideas, the relationships are clear. So, a lot of things to look at here. Now, the rubric itself still doesn't give us a lot of details as to what they're looking for specifically. But it does mention in fairly strong terms, that it has to be a response that sounds very confident at least. Now, we're not going to look at all of the other levels, but again, as you notice, even with response 3, the language is still mostly positive. And in fact, at the last sentence of the general description mentions that a response is characterized by at least 2 of these things. So again, here this kind of gives us an idea that at least if we have 2 strong responses in, let's say, our language use and maybe topic development, that maybe we could still have some issues with pronunciation, but still get a fairly good response. And a 3 is still a good response. As we move to the second one, though, you'll notice that the language starts becoming a little more negative. So notice, for example, it says, but the topic is, the development of the topic is limited. It has some problems, and problems with delivery and overall coherence. And meaning may be obscured, which means it may not be understood. Then as you get to 1, of course, notice it says it's very limited. And then, of course, a 0 means you either made no attempt, or perhaps you spoke in your language, or the response you gave was totally unrelated to the topic. So, in summary, a good response is coherent, which means it's logical and relevant to the topic. It contains good grammatical structure with no major errors that prevent understanding. Contains good vocabulary, interesting words and ideas for expression. It's well structured. It has a nice flow between ideas, and you're using signal words to organize the flow. Again, we'll talk more about that in a moment. It contains a very few filler ideas. Now, we'll talk more about speaking errors in a minute, but for example, it doesn't include long pauses or words or utterances such as And then finally, the key word here is intelligible. Notice it doesn't mean perfect, so it means you may have a few speaking errors, but the fact is it's still generally understandable. Now this brings us to our first hint, and a lot of this is kind of based on my experience. So I think really the TOEFL is ultimately looking for the way you express yourself, focusing specifically on vocabulary. So the first thing I tell students is to avoid words that I call the blah words. So really the idea here is that I think you can really get a good score or improve your score if you use good specific vocabulary words. But too often, students rely on words that are very general or have vague meaning. And I call these blah words because these words are used so often that they almost lose all meaning. Now, over on the left side of the screen, I've got a list of some blah words. Now, these are words that we tend to use a lot in conversation, but if you use them too much, they generally lose their meaning. So part of the idea is to think about in this little exercise, how can we get to words that are stronger, that are more specific? Well, here are some examples. Now, I'm not suggesting that these are the only examples, but certainly they give you an idea of what we're looking for. So, for example, instead of saying good or that's great, say something like outstanding or excellent. Instead of the word nice, we could say something like pleasant. If just to say that something's bad, we could say something like, well, that food was disappointing, or it was awful, or terrible. Instead of just saying, I had a fun time, we could say, it was thrilling or exciting. I'm mad or angry. We could say, that was infuriating or very upsetting. Instead of happy, we could say something like, I'm overjoyed or elated. Now again, it really does depend on the context, of course. Many of these words are so general in meaning, we use them for so many different things. But the idea here is to get us to think that these words do have other stronger expressive ideas. So again, instead of just saying I'm happy, for example, if you won the lottery, you would probably be more than happy. You would be overjoyed. So part of the goal here in this activity, I think, is we want to avoid using these fairly general words, and we want to use stronger words, words with more power. And you will also see this is true when we give details. When we give details, we need to be very specific. So again, the words we need to use need to be specific as well. Now again, in my opinion, I think the TOEFL places more emphasis on the words and ideas you use than on the grammatical structure of those words and ideas. In other words, using strong vocabulary can cover up for other problems. As you practice for the test, really try to include specific and interesting vocabulary in your responses. Now, one more little hint I'm just going to throw in here before we get started is don't make lists. This is another problem that students often have when they give responses to the question, is oftentimes they just want to list words. And I don't think that's what the test is looking for at all. What they want is for you to go into detail. And many times students think, well, as long as I can keep speaking for 45 seconds, then I can prove that I'm fluent. But that is not the purpose of this task. The purpose is not just to fill up the time. So again, instead, think about the reasons. So my first advice here, as we're getting into preparing for the response, is instead of thinking of many, many different reasons, just try to focus on 2 or 3. So in this case, think about in our example, let's think of 2 or 3 reasons why we like to go to this place, and then spend more time elaborating on those 2 or 3. Remember, the TOEFL places more emphasis on quality of expression. So there are many times, especially in the examples I've seen before, where a student may finish in 43 seconds or 42 seconds, but still get a very good score because they gave a very good detailed response. Of course, there have been other situations where I've seen students keep speaking and speaking. They didn't finish their response, but again, they got a good score because they gave good information. So please remember, the 45-second limit is not supposed to give a complete picture of you as a speaker. It's only giving a quick thumbnail of your speaking abilities. So keep that in mind. We don't have to impress them, by putting every word we know in the 45 seconds. The idea is to give a good quality response. So, what is the TOEFL really looking for? Now that we've discussed a lot about what we think the TOEFL in general terms is looking for or what it's not looking for, the question is, how can we definitively know this? Well, again, this is a challenge here because ETS does not publicly provide actual responses and answers for this part of the test. So the only thing I can suggest is that you need to get actual ETS published materials. So I am going to include here very quickly a list of these ETS approved resources that might help you. And again, you will find this in our website as well. Again, the first thing I would recommend is if you're preparing for the test, you need to have the official guide to the TOEFL. And there's the 4th edition is now out by ETS. And really, this is where a lot of the ideas are coming from in this video, in the sense, because this is the only location that I found that we could find authentic responses and how they were actually evaluated. ETS offers other products as well, TOEFL Practice Online, where you can, again, pay money, but then you can have evaluations by ETS. And then another product is that you can also get some official TOEFL IBT tests. And this is a new product, I think, from ETS. They include 5 practice tests with authentic questions. Now, I don't think they include actual speaking results, but you can see what some of the actual topics would be. Now, again, I'm not an ETS representative, but this is an ETS test. So my advice is you really do need to get the ETS materials in order to really understand what ETS is looking for. And ETS has also just put out a new website, and really much of the information you find here can be found at the old TOEFL website. But this is a new website they've put together. It's called TOEFLGoAnywhere.org. And of course, ETS has other resources as well. They do have a YouTube channel where they like to give some hints and things to help. So again, you can find a lot of that information at this website as well. So now let's talk about how to prepare for the response. Now, it's important to understand that in this video, we're going to be looking at two different types of preparation. So the first thing we need to distinguish is that preparing for the test is going to be a little bit different from preparing a response during the test. So in this section, we're actually going to discuss some basic strategies on how to do both. But please keep in mind that if you're going to prepare for the test, in my opinion, you can't really just do it, watching this video and then go take the test. You really need to practice a lot in order to become better at this. So if you're going to be able to use your 15 seconds wisely, you really need to put in lots of hours of practice before you do that. It's funny to think we have to put in many hours of practice to be good at 15 seconds of preparation, but it really does help. So we're going to try a little exercise. This is an exercise I like to do with my students in class. It's called brainstorming, and we're going to be using an idea called a graphic organizer. Now, first off, you may have heard of brainstorming before, but brainstorming is a word activity where we try to think up of words and ideas that relate to the topic we are discussing, but in a specific period of time. So, for example, we can't just brainstorm for days and days and days. At some point, we do have to stop. So in this activity, we're just going to brainstorm for a few minutes. But this activity is a great way to get us thinking about the topic in more direct terms. Students often have trouble getting specific because they don't think in direct terms. So in this case, we're going to think in that way rather than just trying to give a response. But we need a way to organize these ideas. Oftentimes people, when they brainstorm, they may just write words down on a piece of paper. That doesn't help us for this part of the test. We need a way to organize our thoughts. So a graphic organizer is a visual tool that will help us do just that. So we're going back to the topic again and thinking about the topic a little bit as we're getting ready for this activity. Now, the first thing we need to ask is, what is the task really asking you to focus on? Which words or ideas really stand out? Well, again, the idea here is it's a place we go to often. So it's a place we visited before, not just a place we want to go to. So that would not be correct. We can't say that I want to go to this place. It has to be a place that you've already visited and that it's important to you. Now, for example, the kitchen might be a place you visited a lot and it might be important to you, but it may not necessarily make for an interesting response. So again, I think the first thing we need to think about is we want to make sure we choose an interesting place. So again, the key really to this activity, and I think it's the key to the test as well, is that we have to be able to think of many associated words and ideas quickly. Now, what I would like for you to do is to find a piece of paper. Just a big empty piece of paper, nothing on it. Now, in the middle, I want you to draw a circle like you see here. Now, before you write anything, I think, since we're talking about an important place that we visited before, I think we should go ahead and put that place in the middle, because it's usually easier to think of ideas associated with a specific example. So in my example, instead of putting an important place, I'm going to put my answer, and my answer is Mackinac Island in Michigan. Now, maybe you've heard of this place, but it's a place I've been to several times, and I really enjoy it, and I think it's very important to me. And the key is to think about why. Well, that's what we're going to do next. But remember, the activity doesn't specify the type of place. Now, you could choose the library or your kitchen or Paris, France. It's any place that's important to you, but I would suggest choosing some place that's interesting. Now we're going to divide the page into 4 quadrants, just like this. Next, we're going to write down these parts of speech in these places. So, for example, nouns on the left, upper left, adjectives on the upper right, verbs on the lower left, and then I'm also going to write not sure. So do that now on your piece of paper. So the objective here is we're going to take the next 3 to 5 minutes and we're going to try to write down as many ideas as you can that you would associate with this place. Now, I'm going to suggest that you try to get at least 3 words or ideas in each quadrant. Now, if you're not sure about what part of speech it belongs under, then put it in the not sure quadrant. Now, as you're doing this, I want you to think of a couple of objectives. First off, try to think of as many different ideas without repeating yourself. So, for example, if you wrote down the word big, or if you don't write down the word big if you've already written down the word huge. Those are basically the same idea. And another objective is to try to be a little creative. So don't just go for simple ideas. Really think about what you want to say. Be specific. So, and also don't be afraid to write phrases. So, for example, instead of just saying beautiful, well, say something like it's especially beautiful in the autumn. So when I think about my place in Mackinac, I'm really going to think of specific places, details, perhaps even, again, the times of the year that I visited. So we're going to begin. Now, we're going to take about 5 minutes, really. I'm going to suggest that you pause the video at this moment and come back in 5 minutes. And the idea here is that as we're doing this, I'm going to be doing my exercise too on the screen. Okay, so we pause the video. We're returning in 5 minutes. All right. Now here are my answers. And again, I'm not going to go through each one, but I want you to notice that in each quadrant, I tried to put at least 3 and possibly even more, and I tried to be very specific. Now, let's start with the nouns. I'm just going to point out a few here. Again, when I think of Mackinac Island, I think of specific places I like to visit on the island. But I also like to think about other things, like where it's located. So, for example, the island itself is located on Lake Michigan. Now, one of the nice things about the island is that there are no cars allowed on the island, only bicycles and horse-drawn carriages. It has a nice little historic downtown with lots of little candy shops and places to shop and restaurants. But it also has some historic places like Fort Michilimackinac and the famous Grand Hotel. Now notice, when I looked at each part of speech, I tried to think of specific words and ideas that really helped kind of define what my belief was, my idea or opinions about this place were. So again, even if I didn't have 3 or 4 ideas, I tried to really force myself. I tried to force myself to think of those. So for example, I put relaxing and peaceful, which are kind of the same idea, but I really wanted to include as many words as I could. But again, we don't want to repeat ourselves. So again, I don't necessarily need both words. Now, here are a few I wasn't sure where to put them in. Now, obviously, I'm doing this for the purpose of the activity, but for example, Victorian-era homes could also have gone into the nouns category, but I'm just indicating that if you weren't sure what the part of speech was for these particular ideas, then you can put it here in this quadrant too. Now, hopefully, you came up with a lot of specific ideas and places, words to use to describe your place. Now, the question is, how can I take all of these words and make it seem like it's going to work for a response? Well, the first thing I want you to think about is, do any of the ideas I have on my brainstorming activity seem to belong together? Could I organize them under maybe 2 or 3 different categories? So as we go back to my response, I'm going to pull out my pen tool, and I'm going to see if I can't kind of group some of these ideas together. Now I'm going to choose a different color here, so let's choose blue. Well, for example, I noticed that I have a lot of ideas kind of connected to the idea of history. So, here's one, here's another. I mentioned these 2 places here. Now look throughout the rest of my response. Do I have any others that seem to be related to history? Well, I do mention that one of the nice things I can do is to see life from what it looked like in the past. There are also lots of Victorian-era homes. So I seem to have a lot of ideas kind of connected to the idea of history. So these seem to belong together. Now let's use a different color. I'm going to use green. Can I find another? Well, part of the idea here, I do see that I have kind of a connection to the way things look. I said that, for example, I think of Mackinac as a very scenic place. So, for example, it's always, in my mind, always very green and lush. Also, lots of gorgeous sunsets off the beach. I can take pictures of these places around town. So, I find it to be that these particular words seem to really kind of connect to each other. Well, and just for the sake of this activity, can we think of... And just for the sake of this activity, can we think of maybe one more category? Well, this time I'll use red. What else can we do? Well, I do see that one of the reasons I like to go to Mackinac is I find it very relaxing, which, of course, again, I could group together with peaceful. It helps me do a lot of activities that are relaxing, like strolling downtown, riding a bicycle. Again, I could even include taking photos in this one, because that's, for me, a very nice, relaxing hobby that I like to do. So it seems like I have about 3 different categories that I could take away from this activity that all seem to relate to each other. So if I could summarize these into 3 simple words, I could say that Mackinac is historic, it's relaxing, and it's very scenic. Now, part of the thing we need to realize is that in this particular activity, again, this is an activity we're doing to help us learn how to brainstorm ideas. We don't have to include all 3 points in the 45 seconds. Remember, our goal is to make it an interesting response, and that gives specific details and interesting vocabulary. So I don't just want to include all 3 if I'm just going to be listing this information. I need to really think about why. Why? So again, when I think about the reason why I like it, the fact that it is historic, I need to think about why I like history. Why is it important to be relaxed when you go on vacation? And of course, how important is something scenic to me? So again, I just don't want to list all of these places. I need to give reasons too. But this is a good start. Now I can focus on these 3 particular areas. Now, of course, during the test, we don't have time to brainstorm all of these words and ideas. So this exercise is really a way to help strengthen our brain, if you think about it. It's a way to get us to start thinking more quickly. On the test, we have only 15 seconds to prepare. But remember, the point of this activity is to get you in the habit of thinking of information quickly. But on the actual test, I would probably recommend writing down a few ideas on a piece of paper, which is permitted on this part of the test. So in our example, by thinking of specific images of my favorite place, so again, I thought about actual images like horse-drawn carriages or those beautiful views of Lake Michigan, taking photos, I was able to quickly identify those basic reasons why I enjoy going there. So on the actual test, try to think of those basic reasons and write them down, but not necessarily in complete sentences. But at the same time, try to visualize these specific details and ideas you would like to include in your response. Now it's your turn. So look at your graphic organizer and see if you can find maybe 2 to 3 categories that you could group your ideas under. So a final word on brainstorming. Again, the key to this technique is to be specific. Many times students just want to use general words or ideas to express themselves, which makes for a very uninteresting response. You need to be as specific as possible in giving your answer. So again, use actual details, names of places, anything that helps the listener visualize your response. And as mentioned before, this is not a technique that you can use on the test day, but it is an effective exercise in getting you to think in a more organized way, while also generating ideas quickly. So in the beginning, in order to get you into better practice for this, to help you better prepare for the test, try giving yourself more time to use this technique, so maybe between 3 to 5 minutes. But as you keep practicing, each day or maybe a couple of weeks, try reducing that time. So for example, instead of thinking in 3 minutes, then reduce it in an even increment. So go from 3 minutes to 2.5 minutes to 2 minutes. Eventually, try to bring your time down to 30 seconds and then to 15 seconds. I think you will see that because of this practice, it will get you in the idea of thinking faster. Now we're going to move on to talking about delivering the actual response. Now, the first thing here that I need to stress is that many TOEFL textbooks, and this is not including ETS, but many TOEFL textbooks suggest organizing your response as if it were some kind of personal essay, which might be good in writing, but I don't think that's what they're looking for in the speaking section. In my opinion, it's better to think of this activity as an example of what we call extemporaneous speaking. Now, extemporaneous speaking really involves, taking and delivering a spoken response using only a few prepared notes and then just relying on some basic organizational ideas and strategies. Now, we're going to discuss two basic strategies here. The first one, I think, is perhaps more a piece of advice than just an actual strategy, which is getting to the point. Many students actually have problems with repetition. The first mistake, really, is that students want to repeat the actual prompt in their response, which in this case wastes only valuable seconds. So, for example, sometimes students begin with a response, "The place that I go to often and think that is important is," and then they give the answer. Well, again, in this case, just get directly to the point. So, in this case, remember, it's not a formal speech or personal essay. It's just extemporaneous speaking. So, don't worry about giving an introduction. Just get to your answer. So, in this case, in my response with Mackinac, I could say, "I enjoy going to Mackinac Island, which is located in Lake Michigan, just off the coast of the lower Michigan Peninsula." Then I go ahead and start giving my reasons. Or I can be even more direct. Mackinac Island in Lake Michigan is my favorite place to go for many reasons. And then I'm ready to go. So instead of repeating the prompt, I just get to the point. Now, of course, in your example, what could you say? How would you begin your response? We don't need a formal introduction, just answer the question. Now, another part of this issue, in terms of just a strategy or a way of thinking, is that students often have many speaking errors, and part of it is because they're not prepared or they're having difficulty finding the next idea. So sometimes they include a lot of repetition or the overuse of filler words and ideas. Now, here's one example. "Mackinac is my favorite place to go. One reason why it's my favorite place to go is..." So notice I just repeated myself. Not a good idea. So part of the goal of the extemporaneous speaking is we want to sound confident, not memorized or rehearsed. So we need to keep in mind that I don't want to repeat myself over and over. Here's another example. The island is beautiful and pretty, See, notice I didn't really say a lot, but I had lots of words or ideas. I said and I repeated the word island. I said beautiful and pretty, which is basically the same idea. And then I include the famous filler expression, which of course really means nothing. Now, of course, there are other common speaking errors we need to be aware of as well. For example, false starts and interruptions. Stuttering at the beginning. The island, Notice I'm stuttering or kind of repeating myself or not really starting the response. Words such as overuse of the same words, oftentimes using connecting words. Many students want to just keep overusing words such as and or but or because. And of course, those filler words or ideas, words such as it's like this or Another common speaking error is including long pauses or gaps. If you're thinking of the next idea, that's again not a good thing. Extemporaneous speaking means we have to have a nice fluid connection to our answers, not a lot of pauses. And of course, one problem is students either speak too fast or too slow. Speaking too fast sometimes is a big problem because they're thinking too much about the time. And then finally, and of course this is a more broad speaking problem, but speaking in an unclear, unintelligible way. And of course this happens a lot with students who still may have some accent or pronunciation issues. Now this does bring us to a point. So in extemporaneous speaking, the key is to think about, well, what does this all mean? Okay, I understand I shouldn't make mistakes, but what happens if I do make a mistake? Well, again, extemporaneous speaking is not the same as delivering a speech. A speech is something you've prepared, memorized, perhaps rehearsed and practiced the exact same words over and over. On the test, you don't have that option. So the key is to think about, you've got to keep going. Many times students want to go back and correct or repair themselves, but the problem is that just makes you more nervous. And you're probably going to make more mistakes if you keep trying to fix a problem. So if you do make a mistake or struggle with a particular part of the speaking task, just move on to the next part, your next idea or the next word. Now, I understand that that's easier said than done, but the key to building confidence for this part of the test is to practice a lot. Now, in just a moment, we're going to talk about how we can actually get better at this particular activity. You might be thinking, well, if I can't, memorize a speech, how can I get better and more confident if I don't know what exactly the topic's going to be? Well, again, part of the goal is to practice a lot, and you'll get better at it as you practice. Now, the second idea of the strategy is cohesion. And this is where we really come into the idea of how to connect information. Now, cohesion, kind of broadly defined, is when you use repeated or rephrased ideas to help emphasize the main ideas of what you are saying. It also involves the use of signal words. And signal words are key, I think, to this part of the test because it helps the response flow and fit together. Now, signal words can help in many different ways. They can give steps in a process, such as first, next, or finally. And again, this is one that students use the most, I think, on this part of the test. They can give examples to an argument, for example, or such as. They give opposing or contrasting points of view. However, on the other hand, they help give definitions. That is, or this means. So in our example, now it's actually time to listen to my example. And as you listen, what I want you to notice is how I use a variety of cohesive devices to help provide a connection between the ideas in the passage. So now I'm going to give you my 45-second response. As you listen, see if you can identify and recognize the various cohesive ideas I use, and see, again, how I try to use them to explain certain ideas. I really enjoy going to Mackinac Island, Michigan, for many reasons. First off, it's a very historic place, and I'm just fascinated by history. The island does not allow any cars, so only horse-drawn carriages and bikes. So you can see what life was like, 200 years ago. Also, they have lots of Victorian-era homes that are all beautifully well kept, so it's a great place to kind of feel what it was like, to be there in the 1800s. Also, Mackinac is very scenic. Lots of, green and lush, flowers everywhere, gorgeous sunsets there in the fall. I love taking pictures, so it's a great place to walk around, stroll, nice and leisurely to take pictures of many of the historic places around the island. So I really enjoy going there. Okay, so now that we've listened to the response, let's kind of point out a few things that I included. Now, the first thing I want to stress here is that I didn't write, I didn't write the actual response down. I just took some of the basic notes I put together earlier from our brainstorming activity. And I also want you to notice that, of course, I do make a few, I do repeat a few words and ideas. I didn't want to give you a perfect response. I wanted to give you one that I think that the TOEFL would find perfectly acceptable. So first off, notice that I only included 2 points, and I really focused a lot more on the first one because I think that's the most important reason out of all the reasons I chose, the fact that it was historic. So first off, you notice that some of the types of cohesive ideas I used was just kind of rephrasing a lot of the same things. I said it was a historic place, historic island, and I'm fascinated by history. I also use specific examples to indicate that. They don't allow cars on the island, only the horse-drawn carriages, so you can see what life was like there in the past. I also included the idea of the 1800s. So I wanted to show you that a lot of the signal ideas and cohesive ideas you use don't have to be very complicated, but they do have to be there, and I think you also need to use interesting, specific details, words, and examples that help make it clearer. On the second idea, the fact that it was scenic, I just used a very simple continuation signal also. I used examples such as beautiful, green and lush, gorgeous sunsets in the fall. I tried to use specific words and ideas to help indicate that. So again, notice I'm using lots of cohesive devices without using a lot of, very obvious words. As I said before, I've used other signals, time, for example, like in the 1800s. So I just wanted to point out that, again, you don't need to have a perfect response, but you do need to have one that's interesting and full of some of the ideas they're looking for. So again, a kind of recommendation for basic organization, you'll see it's not very difficult. Answer the response directly. So that's what I did. I jumped in and said, I really enjoy going to Mackinac. I gave reasons, and first I tried to start with my strongest one. So I thought the fact that it was a historic place and the fact that I'm fascinated by history made it sound a lot stronger to put that first. It's a very historic place because that's how I think of Mackinac, and I think that's why it's the most important reason for why I would go there and why I go there a lot. Also, I connected with specific details and examples, and I used cohesive devices. As I mentioned before, I didn't just say it was historic, I gave examples. I said it had horse-drawn carriages. I also reinforced the idea with, a cohesive kind of connection here, life in the 1800s. Again, that is a time signal, which I think really, again, the TOEFL would accept as a cohesive device. And again, I used specific words and ideas. I didn't just say sunset. I said gorgeous sunsets on the beach. So I think the idea here is that really what the TOEFL is looking for is not a perfectly prepared speech, but it's that it's satisfying these particular requirements using, good organizational strategies and thinking really about, that I have only 45 seconds. It's not going to sound perfect, but it needs to sound confident. And I think really that's what the TOEFL is looking for. Can you express yourself in a confident way using good words? I think a final word about cohesion. Students, in my opinion, tend to rely too much on a few signal words. For example, those sequence signals such as first, next, and finally. So, in my opinion, try to use a variety of cohesive devices to make your response more interesting. So some ideas you can think about, other cohesive devices are things such as time signals. When I was a child, 5 years ago, in 1995. All of these do help connect information. Location signals. Near the coast of Mexico. Around downtown. Also rephrased ideas, not repeated necessarily, but rephrased ideas. And that involves using synonyms or synonymous ideas. So think about, for example, when I say when I said in my Mackinac response, I really love seeing what life was like in the past, I connected it to the idea that Mackinac was a historic place. So the idea here is that in the past and historic are words that kind of reinforce each other. They're not exactly the same, but they're synonymous. So in this case, that helped reinforce the connection between my ideas. Now, I mentioned earlier about how we can practice for this part of the test, and really I believe the best way is to record yourself. This is a way to get you kind of in the idea of what you have to do on the test. So, in my opinion, as you sit down, I probably would not recommend recording yourself, 10 or 15 times. Probably 4 or 5 for each passage is a good idea. But you need to do it in a systematic way, and this is important because it helps you become more aware of your particular issues or problems. So first thing you're going to see is I would not recommend just, recording yourself 4 times in a row. You need to stop and listen to yourself and try to analyze and see what your most common problems are. So here's a suggested sort of series of steps that you can follow to help improve yourself on this part of the test. So step 1, after you spent some time brainstorming your response, and again, we're talking about practicing at home, so again, you can take more time to prepare in the beginning to get yourself more comfortable. But try to record yourself. And my advice is don't pay attention to how long it takes you. Just relax and try to do your best. So after you take some time to prepare, go ahead and start recording yourself. Now, step 2 would be listen to that first recording, and then I want you to notice the following things. First off, did you include everything you wanted to say? Was it interesting to listen to? My guess is, since this is your first time, it probably was not. Chances are you probably didn't include everything, and it probably wasn't very interesting. Does it have many of the common speaking errors we discussed before? Again, since this was your first time, it probably has lots of them. You probably repeated yourself. You probably had lots of gaps in time. You, again, probably had a lot of pauses, or you said, maybe you didn't even really get to more than one point. And then finally, how long did it actually take you to respond? Now, in my experience, most students actually finish in a very short amount of time. They usually are out of ideas by about 15 to 30 seconds. Of course, some students do take longer. Some students who may be very good at giving lots of words or speak very fluidly may have taken over a minute. So the problem here is we need to speak in a natural, relaxed way. So remember, the goal is not just to fill 45 seconds with lots of words. Now, in step 3, what I want you to do is record yourself again, but this time I really want you to think about, concentrate on eliminating the ideas that weren't successful, and try to include more detail and information. And as you begin to record yourself more and more, start to pay more attention to time. So if you were under 45 seconds, maybe you have another point that you can include. If you were over 45 seconds, maybe by a minute, or maybe you were at a minute instead of 45 seconds, just relax and concentrate on the ideas that are the most important. More than likely, your first recording included too much information then, so focus only on the most interesting and relevant. So if you were over that amount of time, you probably had too much. So just keep it kind of short. Now again, I've seen examples where students kept speaking and the 45 seconds finished. That's okay. That's perfectly fine. We don't need a conclusion necessarily. This is just an extemporaneous speaking exercise. And then I would suggest for each passage, repeat this process a couple more times. Record yourself, listen to yourself again, focus on your errors, try to reduce those common speaking problems and filler ideas. As you continue to do this more and more, I think you'll become more comfortable with the idea of speaking on a microphone and speaking on the computer. And I think also your idea of time will continue to improve. What's funny is, at first, students think, 45 seconds, that's not very long. But then when they start speaking, they realize 45 seconds is a long time. So part of the problem is students are not aware of the 45-second time. You need to practice and rehearse that 45 seconds over and over in order to understand how long that is. So our final thoughts for this first video. On the independent speaking task, the free choice, the first thing we discussed is analyze the prompt. Focus on key words in the prompt. What specifically are they looking for? Remember, it will most likely contain vague or extreme wording, so the answer you come up with needs to be specific. Now, of course, there is no objective right or wrong answer, but don't choose a general answer. Be very specific. If it asks for a certain place or time or event, you need to come up with a specific time or place and have some details, some actual examples that you can use. Next, prepare the response. Now remember, on the actual test, you've only got 15 seconds, but take that time to think about 2 to 3 basic reasons, using short words or phrases, while still thinking of specific concrete details and interesting vocabulary you're going to use. So again, you don't have time to write all of those details and vocabulary down, so just focus on the reasons and take time to think about that information while you're preparing. And then, of course, finally, delivering the response. Now remember what we said. Get to the point. Jump in and directly answer that question. Use cohesive devices to help organize your response. Start with the reason and then immediately get to some of the explanations, details of why you like this particular place or why you're choosing this particular answer or so on. Remember, avoid the common speaking errors. The more you've practiced for this, the more you'll become a lot more aware of the problems that you might make. If you tend to say filler words a lot, as you're listening to yourself, practicing, write those down. How many times did I say this word? Oftentimes, students are not aware of the problems they're making. So on the actual test, it's too late by the time you sit down and take the real thing. So you need to practice it a lot. And remember, don't worry about finishing in 45 seconds. Maybe you finished in 42. But try to fill up as much of the time as you can with something that's interesting without just repeating yourself. That's really the key, is that you want to give an interesting response with good words and vocabulary. Now, there are lots of great materials available to help you prepare. Obviously, the official ETS sources of their websites can help you. There's also the official guide to the test. We mentioned that earlier. And we also have a new TOEFL TOEIC preparation website. And again, the link to a lot of this information can be found below this video. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time for Part 2, the Independent Speaking Task, Paired Choice.